Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Follow us on X at CPD China and on Substack at Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars, in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China and co-author of the indictment prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends for crimes against America, China, and the world.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Thank you to all of you for being with us on this day of days. I'm moved to say, having on any number of these programs in the past, talked about the spiritual dimension of the war we're in against one of the greatest evils the world has ever seen, namely the Chinese Communist Party. And on this occasion, in the aftermath of the election earlier this week, I can only say praise God for bringing us to this point where we can have a conversation about a course correction in the U.S. posture vis-a-vis and policy towards the Chinese Communist Party. We are going to have an extraordinary presentation today of many of the best people that we have been associated with in the Committee on the Present Danger China, as well as a number of allies and partners and soulmates in the fight to preserve our constitutional republic against the unrestricted warfare the CCP has waged against us for decades, the people's war that it is declared against us now for 5 years and been waging, and the prospect of a shooting war at some point in perhaps the not too distant future as well. I just wanted to say again at the outset how incredibly uplifting it is to know that the government of the United States will shortly be in the hands of people who are certainly aligned with the views of the Committee on the Present Danger China in broad terms. And we hope in the course of today's program to be able, not for the first time, not for the last time, to put forward specific, concrete, practical ideas for how to effect the kind of change in our, as I say, posture and policies with respect to the CCP, and thereby preserve our country from what it clearly has in mind for us under Xi Jinping, which is our complete destruction, and thereby preserve, I hope, the last best hope of mankind, yes, but also what's left of the free world as well. To begin, we're going to turn to a man whose acumen on all of these issues I think we've come to revere. He has contributed frequently to these programs and to much of the rest of the work of the Committee on the Present Danger China. He is very prominent in his public advocacy of a fundamental course correction towards this challenge we face in platforms like those of the Gatestone Institute, Newsweek, the Epoch Times, Maria Bartiromo's wonderful program, and much more. His name is Gordon G. Chang. He is today going to provide, in the course of an interview that I conducted with him for our Securing America television program on Real America's Voice, and sort of assessment of the Trump mandate as a result of this recent election and the coming strategic course correction delighted to go to the videotape with him now. Gordon, my question to you is, we have seen the president reelected, not only with apparently a very sizable electoral college vote, but also the popular vote, as well as the Senate, and we think the House. This is an opportunity for a very significant course correction. And China, I think, is top of your mind as needing it as well as mine. Give us your thoughts as to both the historic nature of this moment and the vital need to make such a course correction, as well as what it should entail.
This appears to be the most consequential moment in history. And the reason is that in the 4 years of the Biden term, we have seen bad actors, Russia, China, Iran, and even North Korea, take the initiative. And they're roiling the world. I believe that China is waging proxy wars on 3 continents, all sorts of things that are occurring which were inconceivable when Biden took the oath of office. And it's important now for the United States to regain that initiative because the democracies are certainly under attack. This is going to be a very difficult period, but I believe that things are moving in the right direction. We look at what's happened in the last week. Let's also look at what's not happened in the last week. And what has not happened is we have not seen belligerent Chinese activity, either regarding Japan, Taiwan, or the Philippines. And I think we have also seen China try to pull back and disengage from India in the Himalayas. I think all of these things are in anticipation of President Trump. Because the Chinese could see what the smartest people in the U.S. couldn't see, and that is Trump was going to win. And certainly after his victory on Tuesday, we have seen a very quiet China. So I believe that this is an historic opportunity for the United States to regain the initiative around the world to ensure peace and stability. People talk about America first. But there is no peace and stability around the world unless America is able to guarantee it. And we can't guarantee it unless we are strong. So this is definitely the right approach.
Give us a sense of what that approach means in practice. You've talked over the years about disengaging from China. How do you do that in practical terms? And do we need to go completely cold turkey on China, or is there an option to work perhaps over the heads of the Chinese Communist Party with the Chinese people to accomplish both a new order in China, but also a different relationship?
Taking your first question, how do you disengage? Well, it's already happening, Frank. Just a few hours ago, Steve Madden, the American footwear and apparel maker, announced it was moving 45% of its production out of China. This is after, in 2021, it moved a substantial portion of its production out of that country to places like Brazil and Mexico. So it's occurring already. And we're also seeing some very interesting behavior on the part of the Chinese. They are forcing their currency lower. I think they're doing that partly or mostly in anticipation of the Trump tariffs. So just the mere talk of tariffs, because President Trump on the campaign trail mentioned that continually, has now forced companies to reevaluate their production plans. And that's a great thing, because from all sorts of perspectives, when you have companies in China, you are feeding the beast. We are enriching a hostile Chinese state, but we're also putting Americans who go there in potential hostages. So it's important for us to disengage. I know that for many people, they don't like the sound of that. That doesn't sound friendly, but unfortunately, China is attacking us and we have no choice but to defend ourselves. Maybe sometime in the future, when China is not run by the Communist Party, we can have amicable relations with the Chinese state, but not now.
Should it be our policy, though, Gordon, to try to help the Chinese people bring about that change in government? Is that feasible? Is it desirable? Is it something that we should be striving for?
It is both feasible and desirable, and it's what we must do. The fundamental point here is that our elites, our policymakers, our leaders for a very long time have not understood the malicious nature of China's assault on our society. And the Communist Party believes it is in an existential struggle with us. And it's not because of anything that our leaders have said or done, it's because of who we are. You have an insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of America's values and form of governance on the Chinese people, which means we will never have stable relations with China as long as it's ruled by the communists. And it also means there's only one survivor. It's either the People's Republic of China or the United States of America. Once we understand that, then policy choices become very clear, because then we do have to take those extraordinary measures that many right now think are not politically possible, but we're actually going to have to do that to defend ourselves.
Gordon, thank you. As always, a very comprehensive overview, which is the perfect point of departure for the remainder of our program. We're going to turn next to a man who played a decisive role in taking down the last communist regime that sought the destruction of the United States. That would be, of course, the Soviet Union. His name is Roger Robinson. Again, no stranger to our audiences here on the Committee on the Present Danger China programming. He served as a senior director for international economic affairs on the Reagan National Security Council, in which capacity he helped President Reagan formulate and execute a critical component of his strategy for taking down this Soviet Communist Party and its evil empire, namely cutting off the hard currency cash flow of the operation. He has gone on to a number of other activities, including founding and operating RWR Advisory Group and serving as the chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, as well as its ranking member. He has been very intimately involved with our committee for, well, its entire lifespan in championing a similar sort of strategy for taking down today's evil empire, the Chinese Communist Party, and what it is doing to the people of China and what it hopes to do to the rest of us. Roger, thank you so much for your leadership on this. I mentioned Maria Bartiromo a moment ago in connection with Gordon's presentation. You have been a driving force with her and Gordon and others in talking about the dangers of underwriting the enemy, and we're grateful to you for coming alongside today to give us your assessment of the importance of correcting that piece of the relationship at once, what I call Reagan 2.0, stop underwriting the CCP's bad actor corporations.
Well, thank you, Frank. I'd like to pick up on something that you raised with our good friend Gordon Chang, namely whether we can go over, in effect, the heads of the CCP to the Chinese people and see if we can't foment the kind of freedom rebellion that is, I think, very pent up and in some ways ready to roll, barring some obstacles like working within a totalitarian repressive police state that obviously makes any expressions of freedom very difficult, sometimes nigh impossible. But I can tell you that on the economic and financial front, the misplaying of the hand by Xi Jinping, who is a one-man wrecking ball for the Chinese economy, who is responsible, thank goodness, for estranging foreign investors, and their best friends on Wall Street must be feeling double-crossed and betrayed at some level because he's made it so inhospitable, centralizing companies, eliminating due diligence agencies within within China, making it impossible for an investor to kind of get the type of information needed for prudent investment. So I leave it to say that the zero COVID policy was so estranging to the Chinese people. Well, I'll never forget, and I think most of us won't, the pots and pans displayed on the balconies of Shanghai. Those weren't poor people. Those were relatively rich people. They didn't have medicine. They didn't have food. And they're not going to forget anytime soon. So when we don't see consumer demand materializing, it's because there's been a large-scale loss of trust in the CCP, if not outright antipathy on the part of the Chinese people. After all, 80% of the Chinese population gains its wealth, or 80% of that wealth, from real estate. And we know the property crisis has taken about a 30% average bite out of the net worths of this vast majority of the Chinese people. They then flipped over to the equity markets thinking, well, here's a way to make up the gap, and they lost another 30%. Again, that's why I have these feelings toward Xi Jinping being unwittingly on our side at some level, just through his ineptitude and his ham-handedness and his ideological predilections to be a modern-day Mao. So I would just say quickly about the current 1.4 trillion package that has been announced over the last 24 hours and anticipated for some time. And the beauty is of that, in a sense, is that the local government financing vehicles, that is the mechanisms by which the provincial governments of China have been using off-balance sheet to finance themselves, has accumulated debt of between $9 and $13 trillion with a T. And it's made their circumstance untenable, particularly when they lost the ability to sell real estate, which was about 60% of their revenue. There's not a lot of time to analyze this further. I just want to say that this package is designed to help swap out that untenable debt burden, lengthen the maturities, lower the interest rates, and so forth, and try to reliquefy, if you will, the local governments, which are in extremis. In the case of the property market, that hasn't seen the kind of inputs that the investor community is seeking to see. There's this notion that they're going to buy up millions of vacant units, incomplete housing, and get them squared away and distributed to the Chinese people. But that's yet to come. Little in the way of stimulating consumer spending, which is the key to the realm in terms of any hope they have of creating a new economic model now that the old one is exhausted. So I would just say that one of the things we're going to be watching closely are these Chinese bonds. They're going to be using those basically domestically to a large extent for some of the reasons swap related that I just referenced, but we have to worry about dollar-denominated sovereign bonds and corporate bonds. You know, the American people, we don't have a precise figure, but our estimate is $800 billion to $1 trillion in holdings of the American people in Chinese bonds. We've had a single-minded almost concentration on the equity markets, and we've done great work there, and we have shown results there, such as the excising of all Chinese names in the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, the fact that 15 states are now trying to exit all Chinese investments, et cetera. So there's a lot to show for that. We haven't had the bandwidth to go after the China bond market. It's the last refuge. It's a 17 trillion maybe. The point is, it's their last usable massive pool of money. Now that the stock market's been discredited to a large extent, is seen as a casino, then it's the bonds. So I just would say that I know my analytical concentration will be on bonds From a research point of view, this will be original research. Although the Chinese debt at the government level is about 79% of GDP, overall, with the provinces included, you're at 325%, something like that. And so that we're at about 150, if that gives you a measure. So I think that we are seeing the table set for the developments on Tuesday to be very salutary and give us the chances, as Frank said, to drive further into the Chinese economy, its economic and financial vulnerabilities, and to do great work there. We need to have the right Secretary of the Treasury. We can't for the next, it's been 40 years, I think, since I've seen a non-Wall Street Secretary of Treasury. Their job seems to be to protect Wall Street and the greed-driven activities and returns versus defending our national security, our human rights policies, and protecting American investors. So please concentrate on Treasury. If John Paulson gets it, we're back in another Mnuchin from Trump-Vance. That's very bad news. We're going to get a good Secretary of State and Defense and National Security Advisor. I feel confident of that. But boy, we are in trouble if we have another wholly owned subsidiary of Wall Street at the Treasury slot. So I think that, Frank, it might be prudent to leave it there for now. I would just close by saying that on the equity side, we've got to kill those 4,000 A-share companies that are traded in our markets. We've got to go after those listed companies and with the VIEs, down in the Cayman Islands. Their sanctioned companies have got to be excised from the American people's portfolio. There's a lot to do, but in the shortness of time, we don't have a chance to go through that list. But couldn't be more excited about where we find ourselves right now, our strength, certainly our coming strength, and the glaring vulnerabilities of China. Just concentrate on the money. That's where they live and die. That is the subject matter that's never seen the light of day. And I hope with Maria Bartiromo's help, we'll have a documentary series called Underwriting the Enemy that is going to put this into stark relief. And we're very grateful to her for that. So I'll leave it there, Frank.
Indeed. Let me just say, she's started that series already, of course, with your help, Roger, back in June. And it's a very important contribution to our understanding of this problem. And I commend it to all of you. It's available at Fox Nation by subscription. I want to also thank you again, Roger, for your leadership in this space. You have been relentless. You have been incredibly impactful. One evidence of which I think is the fact that in this Congress now coming to a close, there have been no fewer than 10 different pieces of legislation offered to address one piece or another of this important policy portfolio. And we very much hope that there will be much greater progress made in addressing this problem in the new Trump administration. So thank you for laying out some specific steps that need to be taken by the new administration and being with us. We're going to turn next to a man who is, I think, along with Maria Bartiromo, one of the foremost journalists of our day. He has been most closely associated, I think, from very early on in the Epoch Times corporate existence as a senior editor and as the host of an extraordinarily impressive interview program called American Thought Leaders. And I think many of our colleagues have had the privilege of being on it at one point or another. Jan Jekielek is its host and driving force, and a very, very admired practitioner of the largely lost art of dispassionate, accurate reporting, analysis, and commentary on the Epoch Times platform. Jan has graciously joined us to talk about a set of issues that the Epoch Times and its partner NTD have been doing incredibly important work in reporting on. And they include forced organ harvesting, religious persecution, and a host of other crimes against humanity that the Chinese Communist Party has perpetrated since its inception, really, and why it is a moral imperative that we address these topics and, again, see what we can do to correct them, as well as good trade policy. Jan, it's terrific to have you with us. The floor is yours, sir.
Over Frank, to you, sir. Listen, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really honored to be among all these amazing people who I deeply respect. Of course, yes, I've had a number of them on the show. I'm going to talk about this dimension of human rights and the importance of linking it to trade. But let me just quickly jump to this issue of forced organ harvesting that you mentioned. There's about a $10 billion industry of harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience in China. This sounds astonishing, maybe to some of the viewers on the show. That is not as astonishing, but the incredible thing that's come out recently is the fact that there's actually a survivor of this horrific practice, something that I never thought I'd ever see. I've been working on this issue for 18 years. Indeed, it's one of the things that kind of brought me into working with the Epoch Times from the China human rights side of things. And so there is a man who is in America today. He was actually rescued by former Assistant Secretary of State, Robert Destro. And that was under the previous Trump administration. And he has a giant 13-inch gash in his side. He's missing part of his liver and his lung. And the Chinese regime has actually admitted that they did this, which is astonishing. This is part of the intrigue of him having come to light in the last 3 months. I've seen more press on this issue, more awareness being raised by through some of these mainstream or legacy media outlets than I've ever seen in 18 years. So that is, it's a huge deal on this end of things. Okay, since that time, he has actually been, because of this incredible, I guess, awareness raising around the fact that this horrible organ market exists. You can go to China and in 2 weeks pick up yourself a new heart if you really need it. And there's a lot of people that are desperate for this, some sort of price to the tune of $200,000. It ranges. The point is, you can imagine there's a very lucrative market for it, especially when there's a kind of a ready population of prisoners of conscience that have been pre-tested. I'm not going to go into the details of how this all works, but the effect of this is that in the Chinese transplant literature, and this is from a paper of the American Journal of Transplantation, there's at least 70 papers in the Chinese transplant literature which basically in the methods demonstrate that the method of killing the individual was the actual organ extraction itself. In other words, the person wasn't brain dead when the organs were extracted. And so what this speaks to is really kind of this lack of awareness of just that, because this has been going on for so long, this is how I read this, the doctors don't even realize that they're writing, murder into their methods in the scientific literature. And this is, I think this actually speaks to this broader dimension, what happens, right? And we see, for example, through, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the cooperation on gain of function research, for example, between American and Chinese labs. You see, just this sort of close relationship, and the researchers maybe don't fully grasp that what they're actually participating in. That there's that the Chinese regime, of course, controls all of these labs that through this civil military fusion doctrine that they have. Anything that has potential military application must be, as one of Xi Jinping's, top 7 national priorities, be, incorporated into the military development dimension side of things as well. So, here we are, and it's actually in 1994. So it's been exactly 30 years since the Chinese Communist Party has no longer had a human rights requirement when it comes to facilitating trade. So back in 1993, there's most favored nations status was granted to China. I think one of the biggest mistakes that was made. And the following year, but this was actually tied to a human rights dimension. Of course, Tiananmen Square had just happened in 1989. So there needed to be some kind of progress, some sort of, goodwill shown, right? And this makes a ton of sense, because you don't want to be working. How can you have a reasonable trade relationship right, with someone that is doing things like this, a $10 billion organ in industry? You're not working, but you're not being bound by the same rules, never mind the moral dimension in itself. So in 1994, this executive order that had been basically linking the human trades was torn up, and we've had 30 years now, it's incredible, 30 years of human rights and trade being completely unlinked from each other. And I guess this is the point where there is this remarkable mandate in the incoming administration. There is an opportunity to actually impact these things. There's horrible things that are happening. I would argue, through the process of making transplant surgeons in China effectively become murderers and participating in these horrific practices. We've been training them, and their attitudes have been influencing our people here in the West as well. So this is kind of a huge opportunity, right? A huge opportunity to just simply, for the basics of moral decency, right? The opportunity is to link human rights and trade back together in the context of the U.S. State Department having designated China as a country that's committing actual genocide. And if you talk to Bob Destro, who I've interviewed on this topic, he would say there's 3 genocides that the Chinese regime is connecting. We could very meaningfully stop that by just some very good policy going back 30 years. So that's my plea. I think we should develop this quite a bit more. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that. But I'll send it back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Jan. I so appreciate you bringing all of this into the mix, because oftentimes it is neglected. And indeed, as you pointed out, that has been the case by successive administrations heretofore in this country. It must not be any longer, especially if, going back to what Gordon talked about, we are to make an appeal to the people of China who have suffered the worst of these predations at the hands of the CCP. We're going to turn next to a man who is also well known to our audience. He has been one of our duty experts on matters involving energy security. His name is Dave Walsh. He has been a senior executive in the sector, notably as the president of Mitsubishi Power. These days he is with the Takoda Group. You see him frequently on War Room and our program and elsewhere. He is an extraordinary resource, and we're very pleased to have him with us today to talk about the energy security piece that Donald Trump made clear is going to be very much part of his agenda. Drill, baby, drill, I think was his euphemism for it. He couldn't have a clearer mandate for taking this on. But what we're asking Dave to talk about as well is the piece that has been a sort of, dirty little secret, not to Dave and not to those who have had the privilege of listening to him, but the piece of energy insecurity that the Biden-Harris administration has essentially exacerbated by its dependence on the Chinese communists for energy-related technologies and equipment. It's great to have you with us, Dave. Thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours, sir.
Right. Thanks for having me and on this distinguished panel. We've had a two-pronged attack on baseload continuous duty power in the country. I mean, one, through the incentivization of very intermittent, part-time, insufficient time of the day load factor equipment, solar panels that work on average nationally 4 to 5 hours a day only, and wind turbines on land that work only about 7 hours a day, compounded with the fact that we've got a whole strategy of EPA mandates really beginning to completely prohibit the use of all fossil fuels of any kind, including gas, very clean burning natural gas for the generation of electric power. So what this is causing over time, if you evaluate the planned capital spend of utilities reacting, unfortunately, very positively to the stimulus of these incentives to buy solar panels, buy inverters, buy wind turbines, install them, instead of traditional baseload continuous duty power sources, we're only growing the electricity supply in the country by about 5% over on a net capacity basis over the next 10 years, where we're now seeing growth in electricity demand of 3 to 5% in most of the markets of the country. And for a wide variety of reasons, not just AI and data centers, but for basic industry that has always relied heavily on very massive quantities of constant duty electricity, cement making, steel making, car manufacturing, aluminum smelting, pulp and paper. All industry is heavily dependent on baseload constant duty power. So this assault by China in respect to supporting U.S. government activity through various means and manners of thwarting fossil fuel supply through the EPA mandates, but more importantly, encouraging the acquisition of very, very expensive Chinese-made apparatus, be it thin-film solar panels, thin-film PV, lithium-ion batteries for utility storage, inverters for utility storage, and solar, that cost 4.5 to 11 times more than those conventional power sources that are fossil fuel that I mentioned. So they're a big winner from this, from the incentivization in the Biden IRA that's continued the huge incentives to those very, very marginal part-time energy sources. Further, all this causes a massive reduction on domestically supplied fuel, where you had coal being half of U.S. electricity supply, more recently natural gas being 42% of it. The egregious use of wind and solar will diminish U.S. supplied resources for fuel for electricity consumption and displace that with 5 to 11 times more capex intensive, i.e. much more costly solar, thin film PV, inverters, and batteries made in China. So this is much to their advantage. And if you look further at we're now into the COP29, about to take place unbelievably in Baku. We've talked about this before. That whole activity is sponsored by the UN IPCC, which the China initiatives and strategies are very much behind directing, all appear to be about convincing the West to diminish its use of, and production mainly, of fossil fuels, diminish the production of coal, the production of oil, crude oil, and the production of natural gas across the UK, across North America, across the gas fields in Holland, and including eliminating any possibility of fracking in Germany and England. Those activities next year in Brazil, this year in Azerbaijan, last year in the UAE, all in major oil-producing regions. These events are held with the purpose, goal, and objective, it appears, of talking the West out of industrialization and talking the West into very low density energy supply. To wit, these events tend to occur in major oil-producing nations, even to the embarrassment of the Chinese. They're putting these together, these activities for the shaming of the West, in attempting to shame the West into a complete discontinuance of the production of fossil fuels, but not their use. We'll be, if this goes forward at the present pace, and the new administration will be all over ceasing participation in these forums, hopefully, and to some extent defunding the UN and the IPCC as it pushes the agenda of deindustrializing the West through de-electrifying it, which is a very clear policy, and allowing the BRICS nations to be the going forward supplier of critical elements: cobalt, lithium, oil, natural gas, diesel fuel. All the above would shift over largely to the global South, to the tremendous detriment of the West, which appears to be the goal and objective of the Chinese in their management and manipulation of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. So no, we've got a lot of work to do. The administration has begun to was the first term all over these issues. We're going to very, very heartened with the great victory Tuesday that this battle with the IPCC and even funding it through funding the UN may now be called into question, given the policy initiatives of China to throttle industrialization in the West so clearly, so obviously.
David, thank you. What an excellent overview of this complex subject, and the piece that you touched on there at the end, but you might just take another minute to drill down on, is how this deindustrialization, de-electrification strategy is playing into the hands of the industrial base of China and increasing our dependency upon it.
Well, they themselves, while they've been preaching through forums like the IPCC that we in the West ought to produce far fewer fossil fuels so they can sell more equipment here, they in China have continued to embark on a massive electrification campaign, largely through the use of coal. Right now, China has 400 new 1,000-megawatt plus supercritical coal plants, either in permitting phase or in the construction phase. So their actual use of coal for power generation, if you look on an energy basis, yes, they're growing their use of solar and wind somewhat, but much more nominally on an energy basis, they're growing their use of coal-fired generation by a factor of 4 times their projected use of new solar and wind. So they're not doing themselves what they're preaching here, and they're building an industrial juggernaut based on cost-effective 24-hour-a-day electricity, fueled by their own coal resources, some imported coal, to the benefit of their military and their industry in competing. So we've got to wake up and recognize we've got to have industry left to make, even if someone wants to support the Ukraine, shell casings, conventional military hardware, better yet, supporting Taiwan in the longer run. That equipment is made in factories that produce CO2, and it's made with a lot of electricity has to be produced all day and all night long. And they're working to talk us out of the use of that through these shame fests, such as COP28, 29. And while they're not doing this in their home country, they're doing what they should do for their people. They're electrifying China the most cost-effective, reliable way that they can. That part of it's admirable. Well, we should be doing the same, as opposed to accepting their mantra and through incentives that we should be buying part-time energy devices.
Terrific, Dave. Thank you very, very much. We're going to turn next to several presentations that will have a common denominator. Donald Trump has acknowledged, I think, on the campaign trail, among other places, that one of the lessons he took away from his first term was the importance of personnel in the ability of a president to govern, and to govern in accordance with, well, his own convictions as to what the country needs, but also, as in this case, I think, in furtherance of the mandate that he sought from the American people. We're going to start with a presentation by our colleague and the chairman of our Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy, who brings to the topic very extensive experience in the mondo politico, as they call it, the political world, notably in his capacity as the president of the highly esteemed Claremont Institute. He's currently the president of the American Strategy Group, as well as chairing this committee. And we've asked him to talk about a mandate for change and what that means for leadership, what that means for personnel more generally, as well as the practice of public outreach. Brian Kennedy, welcome.
Well, thank you, Frank. Great to be with you. A great panel we've assembled here. Love everybody on this panel. They've been real leaders in this movement. And let me just say, speaking as a private citizen, thank God President Trump got elected. I think he gives us an opportunity to save this country. I'm not sure if anybody quite fully appreciates just how dangerous a spot this country was in, whether it's the deindustrialization that you were just referring to, or our financial position, or our military position. The election of President Trump gives us, I would say, an opportunity to get this right. There's no guarantees. There's a lot of hard work that needs to be done over the next 4 years, but I would say we're in the game. I would also say, Frank, that, the old saying that victory has 1,000 fathers and that defeat is an orphan, that's typically referred to, I think, to just show people joining the winning side, and that's certainly the case. But I think in the election of President Trump, it really did take 1,000 fathers, and there were a lot of people who joined the Trump, campaign, whether it was Robert Kennedy or Tulsi Gabbard or Joe Rogan or Elon Musk, all sorts of people who joined the MAGA movement to make America first, put America first in all of our policy. President Trump described that policy as, and he described the American people really as being the common core of common sense. And so common sense, I think, is going to guide these 4 years. And I would say the great news about those, 1,000 fathers is that the vast majority of them, nearly all of them, and I would even throw Elon Musk in there, no one was campaigning on the idea that we ought to be soft on communist China, or that communist China was our friend, or that, somehow the policies of the first Trump administration were wrong when it came to communist China. I think everyone there sees that communist China represents an existential threat to the American people. That was one of the reasons President Trump was elected the first time, and it's one of the reasons he was elected this time. So I think that's all good news. There's not going to be, at least when it comes to personnel, we pray anybody who is there doing the bidding of communist China within the administration. And President Trump has said already that he learned a lot of lessons from that first administration. I'm fully confident he's going to build a cabinet and a governing administration that will get the question of communist China right. Did he have a mandate? I would say absolutely. The mandate, I think, can be articulated, I'll do it because we're talking about communist China, in his foreign policy. His foreign policy can be stated clearly. What is good for the American people? Now that should seem again like common sense, and he means it like common sense, but what is good for the American people? We've spent 30 years doing a lot of what is good for other people. We went to Iraq, Afghanistan, what have you. You might argue that when we first went into those countries, we were doing that for the good of the American people in reducing a strategic threat to the United States. But when we stayed in Iraq, it was less clear that it was for the good of the American people, but more the good of the Iraqi people. For example, when we've been transferring our technology and allowing into our markets communist China the way we have, it's unclear whether that's good for the American people or good for the Chinese people. And I think most Americans now, after this 30-year experiment, think that was good for the Chinese people, not so good for America, the American middle class, American manufacturing, what have you. And so President Trump looks at all that and thinks, okay, we want to be friends with communist China. He'll often in his speeches say he and Xi Jinping get along great. Well, they get along great because Xi Jinping is worried about what Donald Trump will do to communist China when it comes to tariffs, when it comes to the theft of intellectual property, or when it comes to, as Roger Robinson has so eloquently articulated for so many years, the transfer of American wealth to communist China vis-a-vis our capital markets. And so Trump, in his second term here, I think is going to be guided by the fact that our current relationships with communist China make very little sense, and they are not good for the American people. The idea that we are investing in American capital markets is taking important capital that should be invested in this country and literally transferring it to communist China. We're letting communist China buy up farmland and other strategic properties around American military sites. That's going to end. We've had at least 100,000, but probably closer to 1 million Chinese come across our border over the last 4 years, not to mention the 20 million who came across the border from all over the world. Those people are all going home, period. And President Trump has articulated how we're going to deport these folks. And there'll be There'll be a huge political battle over that, but I'm sure that the country is up for it. And I think one of the mandates from this election is that we're not going to have this many people come illegally into the country, and now they're going to go home. That's a huge thing, and I'm sure Todd's going to talk more about that. But when you look at the priorities of this administration, I think they'll be guided by that kind of common sense. Keying on what Roger had to say, there's also, he mentioned, Chinese bonds, Americans investing in Chinese bonds. It's worth remembering that Americans invested in Chinese bonds in the last century. Those bonds are today in default. Their value is some $2 to $3 trillion. And it would not surprise me in the least to see one of President Trump's top priorities being to the communist Chinese to make good on that $2 or $3 trillion of American wealth that is there. It was something he was looking at in the last administration there at the very end, and I think it's something that's going to be a high priority in this administration. Senator J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect, introduced legislation to that effect this year, saying that if communist China did not make good on their defaulted sovereign debt to the American people, that they would be cut off from U.S. capital markets. Now, that's a huge thing that should be in the interest of every American, given all the harm communist China has done to this society. A closing note, I would say communist China has inspired in President Trump a real understanding of the shortcomings of the American defense establishment. One of the things we do not have today is a national missile defense. We cannot stop a Chinese ballistic missile launched from communist China or launched from a ship off our coast. That, I believe, President Trump saw as a scandal because we're spending billions and billions and trillions now of dollars on national defense and are not defended from a Chinese ballistic missile or a Russian or Iranian ballistic missile. That's going to end. And his push and his emphasis on a space force is part of that. If he can achieve that as well, that will be a monumental achievement, because the country today is in a state of nuclear blackmail from communist China, especially when it comes to Taiwan. And so having a national missile defense and a robust nuclear arsenal is a high priority. I believe he's going to have a Secretary of Defense and a Director of the Missile Defense Agency and a Director of the Space Force that are going to work around the clock to remedy this. It's absolutely essential for our national survival, and I fully believe President Trump is going to make that into a reality. So, Frank, I myself am thrilled about the direction of all this. I think President Trump is going to find the right people for these jobs. I think he's going to place much less emphasis on sort of stature and media awareness. I mean, the last time he wanted to hire a whole bunch of folks who were well known in public. I think he's going to find people who can get the job done. I fully believe that. Everything I'm seeing would suggest that. And I thank this audience for paying attention to everything we've been working on these last 5 years in this regard. I think now is the time to redouble our efforts to make sure that President Trump and the ideas that we've been fighting for really do become a reality. We've been given this historic opportunity, and we have to take every advantage of it. So thank you, Frank, for organizing this. I can't think of a more important focus right now in what we're doing. Thank you.
Amen. Brian, thank you. And from your lips to God's ears on all that you said, especially near and dear to my heart is the missile defense idea. And you've been at the vanguard of trying to help the public understand what Donald Trump called an Iron Dome for America. Of course, not the same system that has become quite famous in Israel for the success protecting its people against various sorts of attacks, but one that would similarly confound our enemies as they contemplate strategic nuclear attacks on this country and protect our people thereby. We're going to turn next to another aspect of the personnel problem, we've sort of touched on it in terms of trying to make sure that we don't have people inside the Trump administration who are playing for the other team, as has been much in evidence, particularly in this administration and in many of the previous ones. Nobody's done a finer job of illuminating the problem of what the Chinese call elite capture and the extent to which they get their hooks into people, often early in their careers, and bend them to their will, and thereby help shape our situational awareness about what the Chinese are up to, as well as our ability to defend against it. Trevor is, of course, an author and filmmaker with numerous books and films to his credit. Personal favorite of mine is Enemies Within. He's also got Security Risk Senators and House Un-Americans, incredibly well-documented resources on the problem of particularly the penetration of our political system. We wanted Trevor to speak to this challenge as it faces the Trump administration, and also to give him an opportunity to speak once again about what I consider to be an ingenious approach to trying to remedy this very dangerous situation. It is, in fact, so dangerous that our colleague Didi Logison and I wrote a book about this about a year and a half ago now, entitled The Indictment, prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends for crimes against America, China, and the world, based on, among other things, some of Trevor's inputs into the previous, I guess the first 70 of these webinars. It's vital that this be part of the change that will be brought about by the mandate we all believe President Trump now has. Trevor Loudon, welcome back. It's so good to have you with us. Welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. I think the thing going forward is that there is going to be some very clear-minded people in the Trump administration that are going to do some great things for America, and things that will upset deeply the Communist Party of China, the Iranians, the North Koreans, probably the Russians, and others. Now, one of the main stumbling blocks to that will be the fact that many of these countries have big networks in this country who have co-opted some of our politicians, our business leaders, our academics, our journalists, etc. And the problem is there that we don't always know who they are. So this is the fifth column. This is the fifth column that has been holding us back in some ways probably for 100 years, since the Soviet Union started penetrating this country back in the early 1920s, right through the Roosevelt administration, up until the modern day, when we have huge penetration by China, Iran, and other countries. We've got an Iranian network operating in the National Security Council right now that's still there, that's been exposed. So how do you get rid of this penetration? I think the key thing is to treat it like you would like organized crime, like authorities have gone after organized crime in the past. And this was an approach adopted by the British against the Thuggy gangs of India in the 19th century, by Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor against Murder, Inc. in the 1930s, and by Rudolph Giuliani against the mobsters of New York in the 80s and beyond. We need to treat the massive foreign infiltration of this country like an organized crime problem. And I'll go back. When Thomas Dewey was told to take down Murder, Inc. in the 1930s, he was a prosecutor from New York, a Republican. Murder, Inc. was a Jewish mafia gang out of Detroit that did contract assassinations for the Italian mob all over the country. And nobody would go after them because there were so many cops on the payroll. And if you testified against them, they would kill you with impunity. So Thomas Dewey personally interviewed 2,000 young men to get the best and the brightest, a small, elite, untouchable squad that was completely incorruptible, fearless, brave warriors. They went out after Murder, Inc. They would catch a few low-level guys for bank robbery, extortion, etc. They would say, okay, we've got you, you're going to do 10 years jail, or you can get witness protection, immunity from prosecution, and you will rat on the people above you. Then they would use that evidence to catch the next level up, and within 2 years, they had the leaders of Murder Inc. on the electric chair, and it was gone. It was over. So I believe the next President Trump has to do a variation of this. There's got to be a carrot and stick approach. And just by the way, I noticed that Bibi Netanyahu is putting out, he's done a lot of stick against Hamas, and now he's using a little bit of carrot in that he's offering $5 million bounties for anybody who will hand over hostages. $5 million per hostage. That's good. That's a very clever move, I think. But so President Trump has to set up a new intelligence agency. Nobody from FBI, nobody from CIA, people from special forces, sheriff's departments. You might interview 30,000 people to get 1,000. Just super vetted, super elite, super patriotic, and very compartmentalized. So if there's are any rotten apples, it doesn't corrupt the whole organization. Then the president, I believe, has to declare an amnesty, say 3 months, for every single traitor in America, every foreign agent. You've got 3 months. If you're a foreigner here, if you're Russian mob, if you're Chinese intelligence, if you're Iranian intelligence, you've got 3 months to leave the country and never return. Because if at the end of 3 months you're still here, you're going to be prosecuted. Every domestic traitor, every corrupt businessman, every corrupt senator, every academic on the take of the Chinese Communist Party, every businessman selling defense technology, every politician being paid off by the Chinese or the Iranians or the Russians or whatever, you've got 3 months to come forward. You've got 3 months to come forward and register your name with this new organization. If you are honest and reveal everything you have done, if you are completely honest, you spill your guts, you tell us who paid you, who you paid, what you stole, what you influenced, who was what the networks that you know of. If you tell everything, you get a chance to apologize to the American people and testify in court where appropriate, but you will not be prosecuted. You will live your life, and any punishment will be between you and God. If, on the other hand, you do not come forward in that 3 months, we're going to have so much evidence from those who do that you will be tracked down and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and you'll probably spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. This is the carrot and stick approach. A lot of people get into treason because they get caught in bed with someone they shouldn't have been in bed with. They get in a business deal they shouldn't have been involved in. Their relatives are threatened or whatever. They want out, but there is no way out right now. Give them a way out if they will spill their guts. Meanwhile, what will happen is that every foreign intelligence network in the country will completely melt down, because the Iranian businessman paying off the senator won't know if the senator's taken a deal and is wearing a wire, and the senator won't know if the Iranian is taking a deal and is wearing a wire. All of these networks would melt down. I believe you'd see several 100,000 Chinese leave the country in 3 months. I think you'd see a whole bunch of Russian mobsters sell their mansions in Miami, take off back to Moscow. You'd see cartel guys move back across the border. You'd have a whole bunch of big tech guys standing down, a whole bunch of Wall Street guys standing down, and a whole bunch of senators and congressmen standing down for family reasons. You have the biggest clean out you've ever seen, and those who would not take the deal and hang on, you'd go after them and prosecute them, maybe a few dozen, maybe a few hundred people. But the American people would finally understand how deep the corruption was, how deep the foreign penetration was, and would get a real picture of the situation and would support the security measures going forward to make sure this doesn't happen again. A proper application of the FARA Act, for instance, loyalty oaths, real, genuine security checks again, which are almost non-existent in the government today. I think this is how you take down organized crime. It's a proven technique against the mafia, Murder Inc., the thuggy gangs of India. It has been applied since time immemorial by police against criminals. Now is the time to use the power of the American state to take down the criminal penetration of this country. I think this would be a very Christian approach, and I think it would be a very effective approach, and I think it would be very inexpensive, very little bloodletting, and if any, and even minimal prosecutions, but it would solve the problem, or to make a big dent in the problem pretty darn quickly. I think this, and
Trevor?
That's my proposition.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You've laid this out on several occasions. Each time, I think you've refined and improved your presentation, and I so appreciate you doing it today, because I think it's one of the most important takeaways from this program, and I look forward to the Trump administration, well, not only giving serious consideration to this idea, but hopefully adopting it and implementing it forthwith, because I don't think there's a bigger problem we've got than the elite capture one.
Yeah.
We're going to turn to another aspect of this personnel challenge with our next guest, again, a favorite of this audience and our programs. His name is Charles Sam Faddis, and clandestine intelligence officer for most of his career. He also was an Army veteran and a deputy attorney general out in Washington State, an author, an essayist, the driving force behind a terrific online resource, and magazine.substack.com. I commend it to you very strongly. I had a chance to speak with him for our Securing America program earlier in the day, and wanted to share with you in this context some of his insights into a phenomenon known as leave-behinds. Let's go to Sam's tape. I want to begin with a very important column at andmagazine.substack.com. This has to do with the prospect that the man who, thanks to Sam's efforts and countless others across this country, is now the president-elect, and a very serious, very determined effort that will be mounted here in the coming days to assure his next presidency is defeated at every turn by, among other things, personnel inside its wire. So Sam, first of all, let me just say again, your insights into all of this, as well as your considerable contributions to trying to have it be different, are deeply appreciated. Tell us what you mean by the term leave behinds.
The phrase is borrowed from the world of special operations and intelligence, and the idea of stay behind programs. And if you think in terms of the Cold War, when we looked at the very real prospect that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact might overrun Western countries, we prepared in advance for the possibility that that would occur. So we organized resistance groups and recruited assets and buried caches, hidden locations of munitions and weapons and all. We effectively laid the groundwork to conduct a guerrilla war inside, say, occupied Germany, occupied in this case potentially by the Soviets, or even in France and other places. So we have now come through this election. Donald Trump will be the next president. I think what the American people, well, it's going to say do not understand. They have gained some appreciation for it in the last few years, but still don't fully understand, is that even when he sits down in the Oval Office, the task of actually getting control over permanent Washington, the deep state or the swamp, whatever term you want to use, is monumental. And there are obviously a variety of issues. At this point, probably people can grasp the idea that, okay, you need the right people in your cabinet, people that are loyal, people that are competent, this kind of thing. But it goes way beyond that because of the size of the bureaucracy and because of all the rules and regulations and laws associated with it. Well over a century ago, the United States, probably more like 150 years ago, we began to go into this mode of creating a professional civil service. And at the time, the idea was, okay, we don't want to have somebody take power and just put all his buddies and his cronies in and loot the place. We want a professional, impartial bureaucracy. And I think that remains a very good idea. Unfortunately, what has happened for us in the interim is the size of that bureaucracy has grown exponentially, and its power has grown exponentially. So we now have this whole giant fourth branch of government that appears nowhere in the Constitution, by the way. And these guys using their rulemaking authority, for instance, which is theoretically just supposed to implement legislation, they legislate with no accountability to Congress and no accountability to the president. So if you include contractors, the federal government now employs something like 11 million people. Leaving aside the vast number of folks at the working level, by most estimates, I mean, people like Heritage or America First Institute have looked at this and said, there's like 50,000 guys and gals at the top of this thing, literally 50,000, who need to be directly accountable to the president. He doesn't need to be deciding whose brother-in-law is going to be postmaster down in Peoria, but he needs to be able to get control of this. So Trump tried to do this by making some changes to rules regarding which positions are regarded as political appointments, to try to boil this down as simply as possible, and which remain purely civil service appointments, by changing something called Schedule F right at the end of his first term. And it never really was implemented, came way too late in the day, and as soon as Biden sat down, of course, he rolled everything back. Well, so Trump has made no secret of the fact that when he sits down in the Oval Office again, he intends to pick up where he left off. In fact, he said this very recently again, and go back to this business of saying, okay, look, we got to categorize a significant number of positions here at the top of these bureaucracies as positions that are at will, meaning I can replace these folks as I see fit because I have to get control of the beast. Well, the Office of Management and Budget right now, as we speak, is rewriting rules and rewriting regulations and attempting to do everything it can before Biden and Harris walk out the door to hamstring him. And, this is not just a matter of government efficiency, obviously. It bleeds over into every issue that we ever talk about. If you're worried about a weaponized DOJ and a weaponized FBI and what the CIA is doing that it has no business doing, or any of this, or Chinese influence, or any of these really grave national security threats, the president has to be able to grab a hold, not fire 11 million people and appoint whoever he wants, but he really has to be able to grab a hold of all these senior positions that run these agencies, and he needs to put in his own folks. Back to the stay behind program. They tried to keep him out of office in every way they possibly could. They're now facing the fact that failed catastrophically. That doesn't mean they are rolling over and walking away, and they being all of the forces that have been arrayed against him. So this is basically the next front in this fight.
Perfect. How does China play into this, and why is it important that the leave behinds be removed in that
because
context?
Clearly the Chinese have gained a tremendous amount of influence over the federal bureaucracy and policy. For the love of God, at this point, we could throw the Iranians in that pot as well. We don't just have domestic political opponents. We've got foreign adversaries that have their tentacles inside our government. And now we are seriously talking about a president sitting down and this bureaucracy saying, you don't have the authority to control us. We don't answer to you, is what they're saying.
Is what they're saying, indeed. Sam Faddis, and thank you for this cautionary note. It is hard to overstate, I believe, and others in our Q&A group, the audience, have noted this as well, to exaggerate the dangers that an administration that professes a profound commitment to democracy and yet seems in many of the areas we've just touched on, notably energy, for example, and I think almost certainly this leave behind business and China perhaps as well, is quite set on doing what it can to prevent a new policy approach by the Trump presidency. This must be discouraged and resisted wherever possible, I think. I wanted to introduce a man whose name was invoked a moment ago, because he has been one of the preeminent reporters and analysts and commentators on probably, well, apart from inflation, I guess, the single most determining factor in the election of Donald Trump, namely the insecurity of our borders and the policies governing immigration deliberately adopted by this Biden-Harris team. The extent of the damage was captured in his best-selling book entitled Overrun: How Joe Biden Unleashed the Greatest Border Crisis in U.S. History. His name, of course, is Todd Bensman. He is the National Security Fellow at a terrific organization, the Center for Immigration Studies. You see him frequently, again, War Room and here and on our program, Securing America. We're delighted that he was able to join us, and thank you for your patience, Todd, in listening to all of our colleagues and wrapping up with your insights into both what Donald Trump's mandate is with respect to the border and related issues, and what you expect it will mean for, among others, the Chinese Communist Party.
I guess I'd start by agreeing with you that the border crisis, the illegal immigration emergency, 3.5 years old now, definitely played a signature role in Donald Trump's re-election. He knew it. That's why he never left the issue alone anywhere ever, any chance he could talk about it, because he understood that the American people were extremely upset that the Biden-Harris administration conducted that completely bizarre social experiment of just a wide open border. But from having me on and listening to me that, I'm often concerned with the national security threat aspects of the crisis. He was too, all during the campaign. Any kind of normal thinking person would be concerned about that, and that would include the massive numbers of Chinese nationals who have crossed our border. And just to give you a little bit of context on that, for 20 years, we've always had a trickle, a Chinese national here, a few here, 6, 7, a dozen, a bushel here, a bushel there in any given year, always far less than 1,000 in a whole year, usually just a few hundred crossing in. But in this case, I testified to the House Homeland Security Committee on this very issue, the Chinese nationals pouring over the border back in May. At that time, there were 50,000 that had come in just the previous, I think, 15 months. That's when they really began surging. Today, that number is pushing 80,000. Think about that for a minute. 80,000, mostly single adults from China, pouring over the southern border. If I am the CCP, I'm looking at that as an incredible opportunity. Obviously, if I'm working intelligence operations, that is something that was handed. It was like a gift handed to me on a silver platter with a pretty bow and all the rest of that for infiltrating spies and making an espionage opportunity out of that. To date, we haven't caught one. But as I testified, one day we will start to catch them. It takes time. Remember that they are trained to not get caught. And we know, I testified to this as well, that we know that the Chinese Communist Party is aggressively targeting us in espionage operations. They have for many, many years using the legal visa system, student visas, scholar visas, and our vetting, our weak vetting processes for those. And to get into our research institutes and our academies that work on cutting edge technologies and dual defense purpose research, and to exfiltrate all that stuff back to China. But I would point out that in recent years, we've caught a whole bunch of them and prosecuted several dozen and tightened up security on some of those visas on the Chinese side. Even during the Trump administration particularly started doing that, the first one. I have to hope that during the Biden administration, and maybe this is a little Pollyanna, I don't know, also was, doubling down on counterintelligence efforts in the visa system. But if I'm in Beijing and I'm running spy operations, I'm thinking the American visa system's getting tight now. Wow, the border opened up wide. And they're letting us all in. They're letting everybody in. So that's why they're coming, because the Biden-Harris policies were to let in 100% of all Chinese immediately into the country. So of course you had 75,000 take advantage of that. Now, it took a long time to start catching the visa abusing spies. It took years before we started knocking them out. And I think it will take a number of years of concerted counterintelligence pressure, hopefully starting with or at least trebling down under a Biden administration to start sussing them out. But the first thing that has to happen, even before then, is that flow has to end. That gift has to be taken back from the Chinese Communist Party. That should be the first order of business for the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration. How are they going to do that? You got to stop that flow. The way that they do it is they come through the Darien Gap, thousands and thousands coming through the passage from Colombia through Panama. And then they make their way through. Now, by the way, these are not dishwashers coming to try to find, lawn care work or something. The typical demographic of the Chinese immigrants that are passing even through the Darien Gap is that they are very, very well equipped, highly resourced, wads of greenbacks, the best equipment, sharp clothes, sharp haircuts. If you look them in the eye, I've met lots of Chinese immigrants down there. I've tried to talk to them. They never want to talk. They are highly coached. They are in the upper stratum economically of immigrants. They have the money to buy their way all the way to the border. They are not your typical economic migrants. I do, however, think that most of them are regular economic migrants who are in the elite of the Chinese economy that just probably want to just live here because it's better. We have a better system. But having said that, I'll just tell you what I believe, even though we haven't had one yet, is that this is an espionage threat. The PLA absolutely moved guys in here, and women too, who are with the PLA. They are here for sure. There is the Department of Homeland Security produces a threat assessment every year. Not every year, but they did do one in 2024, and they just released the 2025 one on October 2nd. You can Google that and look it up. And it tells you exactly, both of those documents tell you exactly what the Chinese espionage services intend to do this year, last year, and that is to infiltrate spies all over to every segment of our economy, to every segment of our academy system. One way or another, it'll take them a little bit longer having come over the border, but eventually they will gravitate to positions where they can capture and exfiltrate material, defense-related material, et cetera, and rip us off. How do you stop that? Well, the first thing you have to do is take the asylum system off the table for Chinese immediately. That has to be no asylum claims. I'm sorry that you are fleeing a communist dictatorship, but we have no idea who you are. We know that many of these Chinese that are crossing, the first thing they do is toss all their passports and documentation. We find them all over the riverbank in San Diego County and on the Mexican side where Tijuana is too, because those tell us who they are and where they've been, country passport stamps. That's a non-starter for Chinese immigrants. You toss your ID, you're out. We are going to detain you, if we can't push you back into Mexico indefinitely until your asylum claim is adjudicated, or you're going to wait it out in Mexico. The other thing that has to happen is mass deportations of Chinese who came in during these last few years. It's doable. They're mostly single adults. It's tougher to deport family units. They are not coming in family units by and large. There are some. China is what we call a recalcitrant country, meaning that they don't want to take their people back. They like the remittances, whatever. Maybe they like having spies here. But the Trump administration can and will do what the Biden administration wouldn't do, and that is to put a freeze on all Chinese visas, student visas, business visas, tourist visas, every possible kind of visa until they agree to take back these deportees. That is a doable first 100 days achievement that needs to happen so that we can track down. We probably know where most of them are, and sorry guys, put them in removal proceedings, detain them, and get them out, the ones that we can. The other thing that needs to happen, and I know you're running short of time, so I'll wrap it up here, is that the Darien Gap must be closed to all immigration. I just came from there. I spent a week in Panama and a week in Colombia on both sides. I met Chinese coming through there. I know what's going on, the NGOs, the United Nations that are making this traffic possible. The Panamanian government, the new one that was seated July 1, has announced that they want to close the Darien Gap, and all they need is American funding for deportation flights en masse. Lots of air deportation flights. The Biden administration agreed in writing to provide the aid and assistance for removal flights, and then welched on the deal and have never come forward. Trump needs to flood the zone with cash and air assets to make sure that the Panamanians, that their political will can actually be accomplished to do this, and you can close that gap. The Chinese will not come through if they know that they're going to be deported all the way back to China. And then lastly, I don't know what our counterintelligence agencies are doing right now because I'm not in there. I can tell you that whatever their personnel levels in whatever, military, CIA, FBI has counterintelligence operations everywhere. Whatever those operations were prior to this migration crisis, they are most assuredly swamped now. They can't possibly do counterintelligence with those kind of numbers. So we need to expand the ranks of those agencies to do that work and make sure that that is prioritized so that we can start sussing out those people with the CCP who are doing us grave harm. And with that, I'll just kind of leave it.
We are. Todd, thank you. This was I think, the most comprehensive presentation I've heard on the Chinese military personnel inside our country. And I so appreciate you taking the time to work through that. I should have mentioned among your many other accomplishments is service as an intelligence analyst for the Department of Public Safety in your native state of Texas. So you have a good sense of both the threat that you're seeing here, and thank you for warning about it so lucidly. Let me just say, from your lips to God's ears, I think you mentioned that we know where most of these guys are and that we could remove them. I pray that's so, and if so, it's got to be done right quick, that's for sure. I perhaps misspoke. We do have one other presentation, and it's a little bit long, I have to say, but it is very worthwhile. It is by video from our colleague John Lanchowski. We're kind of bookending this program with two people, Roger Robinson towards the top and John Lanchowski here at the end, who worked for a man who did what we need Donald Trump to do now. Namely, my old boss and theirs, Ronald Reagan, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, as I talked about earlier. This needs to be done to the Chinese Communist Party. Put them on the ash heap of history. End this evil empire. And John Lanchowski's got some brilliant insights into what are instruments that we are not using today, haven't for some time, in fact, arguably going back to the Reagan administration, that could make a difference in the end game of the Chinese Communist Party. So let's go to the video with John Lanchowski now.
Public diplomacy is a kind of an umbrella term of art that in my book refers to a spectrum of activities that concern relations with and influence over foreign people and opinion leaders, not simply governments. And one can argue that relations with people may be just as important, if not more important in the long term, as relations with governments. Public diplomacy includes everything from the soft side of the spectrum, such as cultural diplomacy and exchanges, to the middle side of it, which is information policy and international broadcasting, to the hard side of it, which is political warfare, ideological warfare, and psychological strategy. We have neglected all of these instruments. There were times in earlier periods, such as the Eisenhower administration particularly, and the Reagan administration, when these instruments were brought to bear in a serious and strategic fashion. But they've been neglected for most of the last 70 years or so, and it is time to resurrect them. The problem is that we have a materialistic foreign policy culture where if it isn't guns and money, or the diplomacy concerning it, it isn't important in Washington. The problem is that there are ideas that motivate terrorists to be potential terrorists to become terrorists. There are ideas which cause communist revolutionaries to become what they are and what they do. And they use those ideas as a legitimizing instrument of state authority in order to protect themselves in power. One of the problems when we deal with totalitarian regimes is we fail to recognize the central fact of political life in those regimes, which is the regime's fear of their own people. They are illegitimate regimes. They are not elected. The people didn't give their consent as to who would govern them. And so they have a huge internal security problem, which is dealt with by informants to the secret police, by control of the economy, control of the borders, jamming of foreign broadcasts, control of internal travel, the Gulag Archipelago in the Soviet Union, the Laogai in China. But all of this depends heavily on what I consider to be the center of gravity of totalitarian regimes. In war, including political war, you have to go after the center of gravity, which is that without which a regime cannot conduct the war on its side, and that without which it cannot even sustain itself as a regime. And in the Soviet Union and in China today, the center of gravity is their internal security system. And the nucleus of that system is the Marxist-Leninist ideology, combined with a monopoly of communications and information, which is designed to control the people, to control the semantics, control the dictionary, so to speak, control how they think, and then thought control leads ultimately to behavior control. The idea is to keep the people in a certain psychological state, a state of fatalism, of hopelessness, of despair, of futile resignation, where they're going to accept their lot under the tyranny of these regimes and not resist. And psychological strategy at the strategic level means helping those people change their psychology so that they would demand and hopefully realize radical political change. And so one of the key elements of totalitarian rule is the atomization of society, where you separate every individual from everybody else out of an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. And nobody knows who the secret informants are to the secret police. Everyone has to censor themselves. Everybody has to repeat the party line. And if you don't repeat it, then you can be recognized as a dissident and sent for different kinds of punishments. And so one of the key things that if we really want to bring about peace with these types of regimes is not the false peace that our diplomats all too often go after, which is to deal with the symptoms of tension rather than the causes of tension. They think that arms, nuclear weapons are a cause of tension. No, they are a symptom of tension. And you can't have a relaxation of tensions. You can't have détente, as Henry Kissinger and everybody in the 1970s thought you could have, unless you have a relaxation of concerns. And so what are our concerns? Our concerns are the Chinese military buildup, the massive Chinese espionage. One of our graduates at IWP who was working in these vineyards said that there are 25,000 Chinese intelligence collectors in Silicon Valley alone. The theft of our intellectual property, which is harming our economic competitiveness and our edge in military and intelligence technologies, has been eroded by the theft of all of this stuff. This is a concern, isn't it? What about the fact that TikTok, which is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, is the principal source of news for between a third and a half of our young adults in this country? There are so many different other forms of strategic influence. The communist Chinese have been engaged in aggressive actions towards our friends and allies in the region. They have a global strategy, and they consider themselves to be at war with us. Only they understand war not simply to be a kinetic issue, but a non-kinetic issue.
Indeed it is. And this is what brings us to the present moment. John Lachowski, I did not mean to neglect mentioning some of your credentials. He was the director for Europe and Soviet affairs on the Reagan National Security Council. He went on to become the founder, initially the president, then the chancellor today, of a tremendously important academic institution in the nation's capital, the Institute of World Politics. I commend it to you if you are looking for training, education, especially in the art of statesmanship, statecraft. We're going to conclude, and I want to thank those of our colleagues who have stayed with us to the bitter end under the pretense that I was going to get to you for questions. I don't think we can do that as we are well over time, but I do want to thank every one of our extraordinary speakers, Gordon Chang, Roger Robinson, Jan Jekulek, Brian Kennedy, Dave Walsh, Trevor Loudon, Sam Faddis, Todd Bensman, and John Lenchowski. I honestly don't think there's a better team of American patriots with deep knowledge of their respective areas of expertise in the country. And I'm privileged to call each of them friends, as well as colleagues who are making tremendous contributions to the fight. I pray that many of them will find their way into the Trump administration and be able to act upon the kinds of recommendations that guests have shared with us. We need them and people like them in the kinds of positions that will make the difference in the course correction that is so clearly needed with respect to the Chinese Communist Party and saving our country from what it has in mind for us, namely, again, our destruction. I want to thank all of you for being with us. Several of you have asked in the Q&A, how will you be able to get access to this video? Didi will make this point as well, but let me just say, the body of work of this committee is all basically at presentdangerchina.org. You can subscribe to these programs in particular there. It's our purpose to try to become more disciplined about doing these programs in this time slot each week. Next week may be a bit of a challenge, but we'll figure that out. But the point is that we want you to benefit from the caliber of people that we are able to present each week, and you can find it there, presentdangerchina.org. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the help that I suspect a great many of you gave President Trump in securing this truly miraculous victory. And thanks be to God for his vital role in it all as well. Back to you, Didi.
Thank you, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day or so of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the CCP captured elites betray the USA. Follow us on X at CPD China and on Substack at Present Danger China. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.